everyone, my name is Sam, and thanks for checking out this video. Make sure to hit the subscribe button down below and give the video a thumbs up. I apologize, it's a little bit late. Going up a little bit later than normal. I got back last night, like when it was dark, from my work conference, so I didn't have a chance to do this yesterday. So I'm scrambling to get it done today, which is why I look like this. But I wanted to talk to you about all the books that I read this week, and I read 5 of them, I think, this week, which I'm really happy with that number. Starting off, sadly, with the DNF, I did not end up finishing The Magicians by Lev Grossman. I really wanted to like this book. I've heard, really good things about it and the TV show, as well as bad things, but, it's all up to, it's all subjective. Everyone likes books and dislikes different books. So I was actually really interested. I love books with magic in them. I love it kind of urban settings, and I feel like I should have liked this book. But it's our main character, Q. I can't pronounce his full name, but Q finds out, in, a couple last weeks of high school that he's actually a magician and gets enrolled in the local magical university, where he starts trying to learn out what skills he has and, specifies what streams he's really good at, and kind of gets sorted into people with hearted magic. And then there he meets a girl and they have kind of a romance. I will say I DNF'd this about page 200, I think it was. Yeah. And there is just under 400 pages in here, so I only read about half of it. However, I DNF'd this book. It was so boring. Nothing happened. We followed him through 5 years of university in those 200 pages, and literally nothing happens. There is no plot going on. Nothing whatsoever. He's hooking up with the girl. That's literally all that comes of this entire thing. He's not friends with the people he was at the beginning, and because they're not magical in this sense, and now he's hooking up with one of the girls at his school who is magical. That's literally the entire point of the 200 pages. I don't understand. I just don't understand. I don't understand why you would write a book that way. No. Couldn't recommend it. It's not really good pacing for me. Then I did a reread of Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. It's honestly been probably I'd say 8 years or so since I've actually read this book the first time. Just when I reread the first book, I do remember the writing being a little bit better. It's a little bit choppier and very I don't know if juvenile is the right word, but very very basic, I think, which I feel that's probably why I enjoyed it at that age, but now I kind of want more from my kind of dystopians. But I love this. I love all of the plot going on inside. You have Katniss going back into the Hunger Games because it is the third quarter quell, and that is, the rules that President Snow comes up with. He's angry that she's started to cause rebellions and revolt in other districts because of the things that she did at the end of the Hunger Games. And now her and Peeta are trying to scramble to keep everyone that they love safe from President Snow. And I loved getting to see how Katniss, developed, and she's the same person, but she realizes, she can't have the same, brass front attitude about a lot of the things. That's not how that's going to work with President Snow. And she has to start working with Peeta, and there's all that baggage of him actually having feelings for her, and does she have feelings for him, and all that kind of chaos. And then they throw into having to immediately be buddies and friends, and not friends, be buddies and work with other victors once they get into the quarter quell, because of a lot of things that Finnick told them. So, or not Finnick, sorry, Haymitch told them. So I actually really enjoyed this one. I feel the plot's a little bit more complex than the first one, and I actually really like that of it. Yeah, I just like this. And the 10th anniversary is coming up, and they're coming out with new editions, actually, which is really fun. But yeah, I think I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. I think I gave the first one a 5 out of 5 stars. Mockingjay is always a different story, so I'm curious to see what I'm going to think of it at the end. Then I read An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. You can kind of see the cover. It's all white. It's kind of hard up front. But this was a really interesting book. I think I ended up giving this a 3.5 or 4 out of 5 stars. It's a fantasy standalone, and it's got a pretty simple premise. It almost feels like this premise could be the beginning of a series with things, or it's in the middle of, a book 1 is in front of it and a book 3 is behind it. There's just a lot that you could have like really, I think, unpacked and gone to town with developing, which I would have really, really enjoyed because I did like the writing and I was really interested in the world, the politics, and the characters. So I was a little bit sad that it's just a standalone. It was so short. So it's set in a world, it's like in New York where there's like a magical society kind of behind the realms that, if you're not magical, you can't really see. And there's houses. And every couple of years there's a thing called the turning where they all kind of have like a family duel and someone dies. And, the winner is kind of like the head honcho cinch. But we go in here and there's a lot of like things that have gone on like before we get here. There's a guy that has left his house and is trying to start his own. Then there's this girl that shows up and is not associated with any family and has these like ridiculous magical powers. And, there's a little bit of a romance between a couple of the characters and he trusts her an awful lot and she starts explaining to him exactly all of the things that the magic system does in order to support the magic system. And it's like a really messed up, they essentially like sacrifice children so that they don't have to deal with like the feelings of what magic does, so it would hurt them. And so it was just really, really interesting. And then there's someone that is hiding the fact that they're losing their magic, and there's just lots of crazy things going on with like the shadow world, which is where, they sacrifice people so that the people in the shadow world have to feel the pain of people using their magic. So it was really interesting, and I found I was a little bit let down, I think, by the duel scenes. They were very, very simple, very, very, like, limited. I wanted more from them, either more time spent on them, or, like, not more action, but more to happen in them, and I just found, like, there were a couple times where the pacing was a little bit off. I was a little bit bored. There were long times where it was just, like, dialogue between people plotting, and nothing, it wasn't really like written almost like there was a build up. Not that it was bad writing, I just don't think it quite worked. So I think, yeah, this is a really interesting book, and even though, like I said, 3.5 or 4 out of 5 stars, I would really, really highly recommend it. It's a really cool concept, and it's kind of like part of like, I don't know, maybe it's identity, that it's like literally like a book about talking about things like in the middle. Like, I want to know why this started or what happens after this now. So I would really highly recommend it. I also read Dreamland Burning by Jennifer Latham. This was a super, super interesting book, and I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. It's one of the best books I've read in quite a long time. It follows our main character, Rowan. She's a financially privileged girl living with her mother and her father in a well-to-do district of her community, which has predominantly always been lived in and run by white folk. And it is in the southern United States. And their family is renovating their backyard, and while they're doing that, construction workers discover a skeleton, and she is curious, and her friend, during the summer, it's a summer where they're both kind of doing apprenticeships, and you switch back and forth in timelines between Rowan going through a situation where she feels race played a role, and she's kind of involved and is a bystander, and she wants to make sure she's kind of comes face to face with the situation, though, even though she's financially privileged, that she's been a little bit barred from a little bit, like she's been protected by her parents. So it was really interesting to see that. And then simultaneously in the other timeline, you saw all the race issues between black people, white people, and indigenous people in this community. And it was really interesting. There's a lot of like, they refer to them as like half-breeds in sometimes in the book, because of the historical context, but people who, one white guy married an indigenous woman and they're living in like a black community, and there's a lot of like mixing. It was just really, really interesting to see that dynamic, because I find a lot of the times when there's books that talk about race issues, they tend to have like just black and just white, whereas this one incorporated another element of having the indigenous population. I always just find that super interesting, especially just based on geography, especially when you're living in the South, where a lot of those times those places were indigenous people lived in those communities, and they were affected by, where places did go up in cities, they generally went up because of like oil industries and that kind of stuff in the South, which is very commonly indigenous land. So I thought that was just a really, really awesome element of this book that really drew me in, and on top of the historical fiction, on top of having it multiple timelines. And I really feel like both of the timelines were so solid. They stood on their own, and like one wasn't necessarily better than the other. They both seemed to have like be pretty consistently had stuff going on. I was always interested in it. This did just like a wonderful job of showing how little we have changed as a society. The one boy in his own timeline, the older timeline, he works for his dad, and he is half indigenous and half white. He refers to himself though as like passing white, white. So unless you know that he is, his mother is Indigenous, he looked like his father. I did find it interesting, though, there's, like, his dad would sell to, black people, even though the Jim Crow laws, like, barred it. He did notice throughout the book that his dad did treat the black customers very differently than he did treat the white customers when giving loans. And that was just so interesting. I think it's something, like, we don't realize, like, I know people who are like, I'm not racist, and then because, my brother-in-law is black, and then they say things about other races, and it's just interesting of, like, just because you're married to an Indigenous woman doesn't mean you're not going to have your own biases, and you can, there's a difference between, like, just full on, like, I will never sell to, people of a certain skin color, versus I will, but I want to make sure, I assume that maybe you're going to default on your loan, or that you can't pay it back, or just all of these different things that it was just interesting that he started noticing them when someone else mentioned that, maybe they wanted a receipt because they want to make sure his dad's not going to mess them over. And he's like, well, my dad would never do that. And he starts looking up like, wow, that's interesting. He does do that to the black community. And lastly, I read this week Revolution by Jennifer Donnelly. I think I ended up giving this a 3.5 or 4 stars. It probably would have been a solid 3 if the last third of the book hadn't been there, which meaning the last third of the book was really, really interesting, and I wish that premise had been expanded. It follows a girl who lives in New York City, and her family is quite well off, but they're emotionally just a total, like, garbage pile. Her brother was killed a couple years ago. Her mother has kind of gone insane. She's never recuperated from that. Her father has always been absent, and she is, all over the place. She doesn't know how to react. She's blaming herself for her brother's murder. She's trying to take care of her mother, and she's not getting any support from her dad, so she's quite resentful towards him. Her dad comes home one time to find out that she is basically flunking out of her quite expensive school to go to, and she's got a passion for magic. She's just not willing to do any of the projects or listen to any of the teachers or anything like that. So her dad says, I'm going to Paris for work for a couple weeks. You're coming with me. End of story. You're going to work on your thesis to graduate high school. And she fights back on him, but ends up getting drugged there anyways. And along the way, she starts finding, like, little knickknacks in this house that they're staying in, her father's friend's house. And she, coincidentally, a key that her brother had found when they were back in New York when he was alive, that she has taken as kind of a memento from him, happens to work in one of the key and unlocks this whole world. She finds a diary of someone, and she's transported back to French Revolution, Paris area, and she essentially, like, takes on the role of a woman who was kind of like a maid mistress to the Marie Antoinette and her son. And her son in real life, after they kill Louis and Marie Antoinette, was left in prison and just essentially just in horrific conditions, and he died at the age of 10. They couldn't really kill him because he was a child, but they essentially let him starve and die in his own filth and waste, and had no, warmth, like physical warmth or anything like that. So she actually reads the diary of that perspective of that mistress maid, and at the time, as kind of a way to revolt, to make sure that, because she couldn't access the child, to make sure that he knew that she was still there and she still cared about him, she starts setting off fireworks all over Paris and pissing off all of the guards, and they don't know what's going on. They kind of see her as kind of like a terrorist, and they think it's a man for a long time. She almost gets caught a couple times, and it's just so interesting to get that perspective. We think of the French Revolution, and then there's the scare after, but I feel like we only ever really think of the French Revolution unless you did, like, history degrees on it, and even then it's the French Revolution, and then there's, like, a lecture on the scare, and then you've moved on to something else. There's that gap between the French Revolution, Napoleon, and then we do other things. So I thought it was really interesting that it did focus on a character who doesn't really get a lot of screen time, I think, in history, even though the ending to him is horrifying and so sad, and I think it really does say things of, like, when we revolt, what do we revolt in the name of, and what are our actions actually showing? We can say we're revolting in the name of freedom, but all you do is go in, take in, and then start suppressing and killing people and hanging people, guillotining people. Maybe you want to evaluate that, even if you're so devoted to a person, that kind of stuff. So it was really, really interesting, and there's a lot of music theory stuff in here that I'm not a music person, like, in terms of, like, playing, so it was just really interesting to hear all the things, and how, she goes back in that time period and finds a musician that she actually uses for a project is using for a project that, you know, connects to how he influenced current bands and, you know, bands in the 80s and all that kind of stuff. So it was just really, really interesting. And then randomly at the very end, she's at a party and she somehow ends up in Revolutionary, and she is that mistress, and she sets off some fireworks to try and, you know, let the little boy know that she's still there to kind of give him some support before he passes away. And that part was so interesting to see her go to that time period. It was like almost like a Heritage Minute, it felt like. And she goes to that time period and she gets to talk to that musician and like show him what an iPod is. And he listens to bands that he actually ends up influencing history. It was just really, really interesting, but it was just such a short part of it. And I'm just sad that there wasn't more of it. She eventually does get back to her own timeline and, you know, deals with things. The main girl, Andy, who's like our protagonist, is probably one of the most unlikable human beings I've ever seen. She's very, like, it could have just been how she was written. She's very, every single time there's an opportunity of feel pity for me. I know she had a hard life with her brother passing away. I get that. And her mother being so mentally out of it and being put in, you know, kind of a space to help her get back on her feet. But she's just a really, really annoying, unlikable person with so much emotional baggage that, you know, it was just very weird if she didn't ever want to tell people in the real world, but she wanted to constantly remind the reader that she feels guilty. She feels like she killed her brother. She doesn't like her. You don't have to kind of reiterate the same emotions over and over and over again when she's already said it before and she's shown it in her actions everywhere. It's unnecessary, and it got very, oh my god, this girl would be a piece of work to have to be as a girlfriend or a friend, like. So those are all of the books that I read this week. Let me know in the comment section if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. Also, let me know what you read this week. I always love hearing that. Make sure to check the description box down below for links to all of these books' Goodreads pages, as well as links to my social media. If you follow me, I will happily follow you back.